Section 40 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, by Julian Hawthorne, editor. Section 40. Some Famous Exposures. Probably the greatest swindle ever perpetrated in the name of spiritualism was recently brought to light in Stockton, California. The medium and his confederates materialized everything from frogs and small fish to a huge boulder of gold quartz weighing several hundred pounds. This latter had to be brought from the mountains with a mule team. The materializing was done through sliding panels in the walls, while the believers sat holding hands about the opposite side of a table and loudly singing sacred hymns. They had the only door to the room locked and sealed, and never dreamed that the spirits who brought the quartz from the mines were mules. Thousands of dollars were invested in this spirit mine, the believers stacking their money on the quartz as it lay on the table at a dark seance, and receiving deeds in return for their money, which the spirits dematerialized. The medium established, or had his spirits establish, a treasury of heaven for the faithful to deposit their money in, and on which they were to receive 50% interest. This interest the believers continued to receive at dark seances from the spirits for a time. Each sitter's interest was found on the table, stacked in front of him when the lights were lighted. When the spirit bank became insolvent and the chief medium disappeared, the believers were out about $35,000. No less personage than a millionaire of Tacoma, Washington, is said to have contributed largely to this spirit fund. I had known of this case for some time before the exposure conducted by a performer engaged for the purpose, and who knew that certain interested persons were contemplating bringing it about, in order to rescue certain estimable persons from the clutches of these mediums. This was successful, and the confederates of the mediums signed written confessions in the presence of one of the most devout of the believers, and a gentleman who is otherwise very intelligent. Upon this the gentleman was greatly crestfallen, but he still insists that there are certain mediums who are not impostors, and that certain mediums in Chicago who produce spirit portraits are genuine. A full and very interesting account of this exposure is given in the San Francisco Examiner of March 3rd and 4th, 1907. I could report enough cases of materialization to fill a volume. These I know of from various sources, and in every case they were invariably fraudulent. I will give a short account of a materialization which a very expert medium, who is on friendly terms with me, witnessed. The gentleman was originally a minister, and afterwards began investigating spiritualism, as he was a believer in it. He hoped to become a medium, and at one time paid two lady mediums of some renown, who reside in Chicago, $3 a sitting for 3 sittings a week. These sittings were conducted for the purpose of developing this gentleman in mediumship. He continued these for a long time, but he was no nearer to being a medium than he was in the beginning. At one time he detected one of the sisters passing a slate to the other, and substituting another in its place. He saw the edge of one of the slates protruding from behind the dress of one of the sisters. They never knew they were discovered, as he said nothing, but this opened his eyes. After this he investigated everywhere and at every opportunity, and grew to be a very expert medium himself. Recently, when in Los Angeles, he visited a séance conducted by a medium who claimed to be a Buddhist priest. This medium was known under the name of the Reverend Swami Mazzininanda. He had an altar in his home, constructed something like those in Roman Catholic churches. He had various candles and images on this altar, including an image of Buddha, and also a number of mystical figures. It was a great mixture of fake Buddhism, Roman Catholicism, and modern spiritualism. The medium also wore the costume of a Buddhist priest at his séances. This priest held services here for the faithful. He conducted all in Hindustani, his native tongue. He chanted, prayed to Buddha, etc., all in a queer-sounding gibberish. Certain evenings of the week were devoted to soul travel, and certain evenings after the religious services a black chapter was held. The gentleman whom I have mentioned attended one of these dark seances. He sat with other spectators around the room in perfect darkness. The spectators were not required to hold hands, so great was their faith. Finally, in the darkness, a queer-looking, vapory, luminous form floated around in the air and paused in front of the spectators. My friend slipped down quietly on his knees and gradually worked closer and closer to the luminous form, until he could detect that the vapor was a kind of luminous cheesecloth. He did not desire to expose this priest, but he desired to have the priest know that someone had discovered him. My friend accordingly took hold of the gauze and gave it a very slight downward jerk. He then immediately returned quietly to his seat. There was an immediate pause in the discourse of the priest, who had really been floating this form on the end of a stick. Everyone knew that something had happened, but no one but my friend knew what it was. The priest then said, in his slow, peculiar, eccentric, and measured tones, "I have received a very great shock, and I will be unable to continue further this evening." The next day, when in conversation with some of the faithful, this priest stated in his peculiar manner of speaking, and with intense earnestness, that which follows: "Last night I received a very great shock. I was just in the middle of the dark chapter, and the spirit of the Master Krishna was out. Having spent the greater portion of my life on the Himalayas, my right eye has become injured by the snows." Then, pointing to his right eye, he added, "My right eye has a defect in it which you cannot see, but on account of that I can only see in the dark with it. I immediately turned my right eye downward, and I looked. I distinctly saw a lady's hand reach out toward my robe in the darkness, and this hand took hold of it and jerked it lightly, just like this." The Reverend Swami here illustrated by slightly jerking his coat downward. It was very amusing to hear him, in great seriousness, relate this in his low and measured accents to his faithful followers. Shortly after this, when the Los Angeles Herald was conducting a crusade against the numerous mediums of that city, and when it had an exhibit in its windows of the confiscated material of some of them, this Buddha priest was arrested and imprisoned for some of his practices. End of chapter 40. Section 41 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 41, by Hereward Carrington. More Tricks of Spiritualists. Matter through Matter. There is one very clever test that is sometimes performed which would seem to show that something of this sort is accomplished. It is, however, nothing more than an ingenious trick, and this might be a good time to explain its modus operandi. The general effect of the illusion is this: the medium requests some one to assist him in an experiment in which he is going to attempt to pass matter through matter. As the test is one in which a confederate might easily be employed, he is very careful to choose some person who is well known, or whose character is above all suspicion. If this were not so, the entire effect of the test would be lost upon the investigators. Having secured his assistant, he hands him for examination a solid steel ring, just large enough to slip on and off the hand and arm easily. The ring is perfectly solid, and may be examined by anyone desirous of doing so. When this part of the performance is finished, the medium and his sitter then join or clasp their right hands, as in handshaking, and the sitter is instructed not to release the hand for a single instant. To quote make assurance doubly sure," however, the hands are fastened together in any way the sitter may desire, the hands being tied together with tape, e.g., and the ends of this tape tied and the knots sealed. The tape connects the wrists and the hands of the medium and his sitter, and this tying may be made as secure as possible. A piece of thick cloth is now thrown over the two hands and the lower part of the arms, concealing them from view. With his disengaged hand, the medium now takes the iron ring and passes it up under the cloth so as to bring it in contact with his own arm. He holds it there for some time, but ultimately snatches off the covering cloth and reveals to the eyes of the astonished audience the ring now encircling his own arm, in spite of the fact that the ties are still in status quo and the sitter never let go his hold for an instant. The ties and the ring may again be examined, if desired, before the hands are separated. This is an exceedingly effective test, and has every appearance of being genuine. Indeed, it is hard to see where trickery can come in. The trick is one of the simplest imaginable, however, and is performed in the following manner. The medium has provided himself with two rings exactly alike. One of these the audience is free to examine. The other the medium is wearing on his right arm under his coat. When the two hands are clasped together, therefore, it is a simple thing for the medium, under cover of the enveloping cloth, to slip the duplicate ring down his sleeve and onto his own hand, and that part of the miracle is accomplished. It remains only to explain what becomes of the first ring. The cloth thrown over the arm is very thick and stiff, as stated, and the inner side of this contains a double partition, a sort of bag, into which the medium slips the duplicate ring. The cloth now being shown on both sides without disclosing the ring, and the medium makes away with it as soon as possible, in order to avoid detection. Deception explained by the science of psychology. The object of this passage is to enable the reader to see more easily how it is that the watchful observer is deceived into believing that a thing is so, when in reality it is not, and vice versa, and also to give an idea of the various methods employed by the medium in order to accomplish his results. I must first of all call the reader's attention to one or two rules which every conjurer learns at the commencement of his study, and which he learns to apply so constantly that it becomes second nature to him. The first is, never let the eyes rest on the hand that is performing the sleight, but always on the other hand, or on some object on the table or elsewhere, as this will have a tendency to draw the eyes of the audience to that point also. The sitters or audience will always look at the point closely watched by the magician. Their eyes have a tendency to follow his, and wherever he looks, there will the onlooker look also. Needless to say, the magician makes use of this fact, and many tricks and illusions are dependent upon it for their successful accomplishment. Whenever the magician or medium looks intently at one hand, therefore, the other hand should be watched, as it is a sure sign that that is the hand which is performing the trick. Another fundamental rule that is observed by all sleight of hand performers is, never let an audience know beforehand what is to be done, that is, the nature of the trick that it is intended to perform. If the spectator knew what was forthcoming, he would be on the lookout for movements of the performer at certain critical times, just at the periods when close observation is least wanted, and would quite possibly detect the performer in the act of executing certain movements which would show how the trick was performed. But not knowing what is coming, the spectator is unable to watch closely at the critical moment, not knowing what that moment is, and so is unable to detect the trick, his attention being diverted by the performer just before this movement is made to some other object or movement. The methods of diverting the spectator's attention are various. There is the use of the eyes, as shown before. Then there is the spoken word, the performer telling the onlookers to observe some certain object or action, and the effect is to cause them to watch it as they are told. They follow the line of least resistance. The combined effect upon the spectator of the spoken word and the eyes together is generally irresistible. Another important factor is this: a performer should always let any suggestion, right or wrong, soak well into the spectator's mind before attempting to change it. This is for two reasons. In the first place, if the suggestion is correct, if, for example, the performer really does place an object in his left hand, and it is shortly found to have vanished from that hand, he is annoyed by hearing someone say that he was not really sure it was there in the first place, as it was covered up so quickly. If, on the other hand, the suggestion given was a false one, if, e.g., the performer says he has placed an object in his left hand, when in reality he has not done so, but has palmed it in his right hand, then it is still necessary to allow a certain time interval to elapse between the performing of the action which apparently placed the object in the hand, and the showing of the hand empty for this reason. If the hand into which the object is supposedly placed is immediately shown empty, the natural conclusion of the sitter is that the object was not in reality placed there at all, but was retained in the other hand, which would be the fact. If, however, the performer allowed some time to elapse between the action of placing the object in that hand supposedly, and the showing of the hand empty, he meanwhile keeping his eyes fixed on the hand, suggesting to the sitters that the object is there, and in every way acting as if it were there, the idea will gradually gain a firm hold on the minds of the spectators that the object is there in reality, and they are correspondingly surprised to find it ultimately vanished. It is just such a knowledge of the way people's minds work, as a friend once said to me, which enables the conjurer to deceive the public, and it is precisely the same cast of mind that the medium possesses. He is, in fact, a good judge of human nature. Another fact that must be borne in mind is that when once a spectator has seen a movement made 2 or 3 times in the same manner, he frequently sees the performer make that movement on another occasion, when the performer had in reality only started to make the movement and suggested the rest. Thus, if the performer throws a ball up into the air 2 or 3 times in succession, and on the 4th occasion merely pretends to throw it up, really retaining it in the other hand, the great majority of the spectators will really see the ball ascend into the air on the 4th occasion, and will so state on being asked. We here depend upon association and habit. Professor Jastrow summed up this portion of the psychology of deception very well when he said, quote, "He, the conjurer, must associate the natural factors of his habits, actually attending to one thing while seemingly attending to another. At the same time, his eyes and his gestures and his patter misdirect the attention to what is apparently the essential field of operation, but really only a blind to distract attention away from the true scene of action. The conjurer directs your attention to what he does not do. He does not do what he pretends to do, and to what he actually does he is careful neither to appear to direct his own attention nor to arouse yours." Close quote. Professor Max Dessoir, in a very fine article on "The Psychology of Conjuring," writes as follows: "By awakening interest in some unimportant detail, the conjurer concentrates that attention on some false point, or negatively diverts it from the main object, and we all know the senses of an inattentive person are pretty dull. When causing the disappearance of some object, the conjurer counts 1, 2, 3. The object must really disappear before 3, not at 3, because the attention of the public being diverted to 3, they do not notice what happens at 1 and 2. A specially successful method of diversion is founded on the human craze for imitation. The conjurer counts on this in many cases. He always looks in the direction where he wants the attention of the public, and does everything himself which he wants the public to do. If the trick is in the left hand, the conjurer turns sharply to the person to his right, presuming correctly that the spectators will make the same movement, and will not notice what is going on in his left hand. Every sharp, short remark will, for a moment at least, divert the eyes from the hands and direct them to the mouth, according to the above-mentioned law of imitation." The successful conjurer has carefully studied beforehand every movement that is made, every word that is spoken, during a conjuring performance, and has seen that these all fit naturally into place, and help conceal the real workings of the trick. The right and left hands must be trained to operate independently and without the need of looking at either. Many conjurers practice doing two separate things at the same time, one with either hand, and the ability to do this is essential. Above all, the performer must be full of conscious self-possession, and feel himself to be master of the situation, no less than to feel the ability to cope with any emergencies that may arise. Turning now to a consideration of the séance, we find that many of these psychological rules still hold good, and their operation enables the medium to perform many actions which would otherwise be impossible. A certain suggestion is given to the sitters, and imagination and inference do the rest. "Our conclusions as to what we see or hear are always founded on a combination of observation and inference. But in daily life it is seldom necessary to distinguish between the two elements, since, when the object and its mode of presentation are familiar, our inferences are generally correct. But it is different when, owing to circumstances such as a bad light, we have to infer more in proportion to what we perceive than usual; or when someone, e.g., a conjurer or a ventriloquist, is trying to deceive us by presenting one object under the familiar aspect of another, and suggesting false inferences. It is not uncommon to find people at séances encouraging each other in the belief that they see, say, a living human figure, when all that they actually see is something moving which is about the size of a human being. The rest is inference." How true these last remarks are is demonstrated by the statement made in the Revelations of a Spirit Medium, that an old wire mask, frequently used at materializing séances, had been recognized "by dozens of persons as fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, cousins, sweethearts, wives, husbands, and various other relatives and friends. None but the medium knew that it was only a 50-cent wire mask, hence none but the medium could enjoy the humor of the occasion." One of the most instructive incidents I know, in relation to this question of the psychology of deception, is the one given by Dr. Hodgson, the case of the officer and the Hindu juggler. In this case a trick was performed before an English officer and his wife, and Dr. Hodgson happened to overhear this officer telling some travelers of the experience at dinner that evening. Referring to the movements of the coins, he said that he had taken a coin from his own pocket and placed it on the ground himself, yet that this coin had indulged in the same freaks as the other coins. His wife ventured to suggest that the juggler had taken the coin and placed it on the ground, but the officer was emphatic in repeating his statement, and appealed to me for confirmation. He was, however, mistaken. I had watched the transaction with special curiosity, as I knew what was necessary for the performance of the trick. The officer had apparently intended to place the coin upon the ground himself, but as he was doing so, the juggler leaned slightly forward, dexterously and in a most unobtrusive manner received the coin from the fingers of the officer as the latter was stooping down, and laid it close to the others. If the juggler had not thus taken the coin, but had allowed the officer himself to place it on the ground, the trick as actually performed would have been frustrated. Now I think it highly improbable that the movement of the juggler entirely escaped the perception of the officer. Highly improbable, that is to say, that the officer was absolutely unaware of the juggler's action at the moment of its happening. But I suppose that, although an impression was made on his consciousness, it was so slight as to be speedily effaced by the officer's imagination of himself as stooping and placing the coin upon the ground. The officer, I may say, had obtained no insight into the modus operandi of the trick, and his fundamental misrepresentation of the only patent occurrence that might have given him a clue to his performance debarred him completely from afterwards, on his reflection, arriving at any explanation. Just similarly, many an honest witness may have described himself as having placed one slate upon another at a sitting with a medium, whereas it was the medium who did so, and who possibly effected at the same time one or two other operations altogether unnoticed by the witness." In reading through descriptions of slate writing seances, we very seldom find the statement made as to who placed the slates on the table, or under the table, etc. Generally the account reading, "The slates were then placed on the table," without any qualifying statement as to who placed them there. Accounts of this kind are absolutely worthless from an evidential standpoint. We must at once ask ourselves who placed the slates in that position, and if it was the medium, as it probably was in the vast majority of instances, then that test in all probability ceases to have any evidential weight. Anyone can read over a number of accounts of slate writing performances and verify these statements if he chooses to do so. Frequently the statement is made that the sitter did actually place the slate on the table, when in reality the medium did so. This error is quite unconscious on the sitter's part, of course, but the account is falsified nevertheless. Mistakes of this kind are very common, the sitter thinking afterwards that he, the sitter, must have placed the slates on the table himself. It will be seen from the above that there is a great difference between what actually transpired at any given seance and what the accounts say transpired. The general public cannot get that all-important fact too strongly rooted in its mind, that the events which transpired at a seance may not be reported accurately, so that the report of the seance may be altogether wrong and erroneous, though the sitters and those who drew up the report may have been thoroughly honest in their belief that the report is accurate in every respect. The effect of all this is very great indeed. Many spiritualistic seances are quite inexplicable as described, but the description is not a true report of what took place at the seance in question. The facts are distorted. Consequently, the person taking it upon himself to explain what took place at the seance is called upon to explain a number of things which, in reality, never took place at all. We must remember in this connection that a number of conjuring tricks as described would be quite impossible to explain by any process of trickery. The description of the trick was not correct. Let me make this still clearer, and at the same time illustrate the difference between what apparently occurs and what actually happens by the following example. A conjurer places a coin, say a quarter, in each hand, and closes his hands. Another quarter is now placed upon the fingers of each hand, so that there is now 1 quarter in each hand and 1 quarter on the fingers of each hand. The magician announces that by simply opening and closing his hands, which are held at some distance from each other, he will thereby transfer one of the coins from one hand to the other, so that there will be 3 coins in one of the hands and only 1 left in the other. Now, if the sitter were writing out an account of what happened, it would most certainly read as follows: "The magician then tried the experiment of opening and closing his hands rapidly and causing the coins to be transferred as promised, but failed in the attempt, the coins from the back of each hand falling onto the table in a rather clumsy manner. They were, however, again placed upon the backs of the magician's hands. The movement was repeated, and this time successfully. The coins disappeared from the backs of both hands, in one of which was now found 3 of the coins, while the other hand contained only 1." Such is precisely the description of the trick, as it would be given by the average person on seeing it, and it would represent his honest opinion of what occurred. As it stands, it is quite inexplicable by trickery. Needless to say, the account is not a true statement of what actually occurred, as the following explanation will make clear. The first time the coins were dropped on the table, the movement was not so clumsy as it might have been supposed. It was, in fact, intentional, being the principal factor in the accomplishment of the trick. What actually transpired at that time was this: the magician, by a quick movement, dropped both coins from one hand onto the table, at the same time dexterously opening the other hand a trifle, and allowing the second coin on that hand to fall into the interior of the hand itself. Thus, while both hands are still seen to be closed, one is empty and the other contains two coins. It is obvious, therefore, that when a coin is placed upon each of the hands again, the magician has only to repeat the opening and closing movement, and there will be three coins in one of his hands and only one in the other. This trick illustrates in a very simple and striking manner the possibility of reporting a fact in an entirely erroneous manner, quite unconscious of the fact that this error in reporting has been committed. Just in this same manner are many slate writing and other phenomena misreported, and hence an explanation of the séance as reported is rendered impossible. The trouble is that the report does not really report what actually occurred. Many of my readers may feel somewhat insulted at this accusation that they cannot detect such obvious trickery when it exists, and that they are liable to make such mistakes in recording a séance as those here mentioned. They may comfort themselves with the thought, however, that it is no disgrace to make mistakes and errors of this kind, for, as Professor Jastrow pointed out, "The matter is, in some aspects, as much a technical acquisition as in the diagnosticating of a disease. It is not at all to the discredit of anyone's power of observation or intellectual acumen to be deceived by the performances of a conjurer. And the same holds true of the professional part of the mediumistic phenomena. Until this homely but salutary truth is impressed with all its importance upon all intending investigators, there is little hope of bringing about a proper attitude toward these and kindred phenomena." These remarks will make it clear to us why many men of science have been deceived by very simple tricks and fraudulent devices while investigating spiritualistic phenomena. Their scientific culture is no guarantee that they are any more capable of detecting fraud than is the man in the street. In fact, their training has made them very much less capable of detecting fraud than the average person who comes more in contact with the world and is an acuter judge of character and human nature. End of section 41. Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Section 42 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 42. How Spirits Materialize. Reader, have you ever attended a séance for full-form materialization? Have you ever thought you had met your dead relative's spirit at these séances? If you have never had the pleasure of attending a séance of this phase, you have missed a rare treat. The writer has assisted at many a one and will relate to you some of the wonderful phenomena occurring at them and the means used to produce them. There are hundreds of materializing mediums doing business in this country who are swelling a good-sized bank account. Their business sometimes runs into the hundreds of dollars in a single week. This phase of mediumship is considered by the spiritualists as the highest possible attainment, and if you are a clever, full-form medium, your financial welfare is assured. Many and various are the methods employed by the different mediums to produce this phase. It is in Boston, New York, and San Francisco that it is worked the finest. The full-form séances most often met with are very simply worked and easy of performance by the medium. You are usually given a seat in a circle of chairs about the front of a cabinet made by hanging heavy curtains across the corner of the room. If you are a stranger, or one who looks or acts as though he would grab the spirits, you are seated at the farthest point from the cabinet, or if there are 2 rows of seats, you will be given a seat at the back row. I made my way to the materializing séance at which my friends hoped to materialize. I was admitted to the séance room and found about 20 persons already assembled. I was seated in the front row of chairs. The cabinet used was a closet about 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. The ceiling of both the room and the cabinet was of wood. After a thorough examination had been made of the cabinet by all those who cared to do so, the sitters were rearranged to suit the medium. There were present now 35 persons. The séance room was very large. The door had been taken off the closet that served as a cabinet, and in its stead were hung heavy curtains. The floor of the room was carpeted with a dark carpet, as was the cabinet. The light was furnished by a lamp placed in a box that was fastened to the wall some 8 feet from the floor. This box had a sliding lid in front, controlled by a cord passing into the cabinet. By this means the "spirits" could regulate the light to suit themselves, without any movement on the part of any of those in the séance room being necessary. When everything was in readiness, the medium entered the cabinet, seated himself, and was tied, and so secured to his chair that it was impossible that he could have any use of himself. He was most thoroughly secured to his chair, and his chair nailed fast to the floor by passing leather straps over the rounds in the side and nailing the ends to the floor. After it was shown to the sitters that he was utterly helpless, the curtain was drawn. The manager now placed an ordinary kitchen table in front of the door of the cabinet, so that it stood away from it about 2 feet. The table contained no drawer. On the table was laid writing materials, a guitar, and small bell. The manager seated himself close to one side of the cabinet entrance and started a large Swiss music box. Before it had finished the first air, the lamp was shut entirely off, making the room inky dark. An illuminated hand and arm was now seen to come from behind the curtain and played an accompaniment to the music box on the guitar. We could see plainly the movement of the hand, arm, and fingers as it manipulated the strings of the instrument. It did not appear necessary to finger the strings on the keyboard, although the air was in a key that made it impossible to tune the guitar so that an accompaniment could be performed without fingering. However, but one hand was visible, and it was picking the strings. After the tune was finished, the hand left the instrument and moved out into the room to the front of the table, and from the sound we knew it was writing on the tablet that had been placed there. The arm was of bluish light and appeared to end just above the elbow and to have no connection with the body. It finished writing and seemed to float into the cabinet near the top. The light was opened, and the manager requested those who had tied the medium to examine his condition and see if the ropes had been tampered with. The examination was made, and it was evident that the fastenings were undisturbed. The communication was read aloud to those present and contained the following: "We are pleased to meet so many seekers after light and truth here this evening, and from the conditions, as we sense them, we will have a satisfactory and pleasant séance. The way to obtain the best results is for each person to maintain a passive condition and take what we have to give. You may rest assured that our best efforts will be put forth to give you entire satisfaction. The Control." The writing was exactly on the ruled lines, although written in absolute darkness. The hand and arm, although luminous, did not give out a particle of light. The arm had been at least 5 feet from the cabinet opening and 7 feet from the medium. Surely it was not he. The message read, the light was again shut down, and the music again started. Once more a hand appeared, and floating out to the table, again began writing. Of a sudden the hand disappeared, and after a few seconds I was astonished to feel a hand thrusting a paper into my top coat pocket. Now appeared 2 hands, and they played an air on the guitar. Now came 3, then 4 hands were visible, bright as the day. 2 of them began writing again, and when they had finished, 2 more sitters were the recipients of sheets of paper. Soon the light was opened for an inspection of the cabinet, which was made. with the conclusion that the medium had not moved. Those of us receiving communications were afforded an opportunity to read them. We found them nicely written as before, and all contained tests. After the light went out again, more hands were seen. The table was floated about over the heads of the circle, as was the music box, which weighed at least 50 pounds. Another examination of the cabinet was made, and everything found satisfactory. This time the light was not put entirely out, but a very dim light was allowed. The music box was again set playing, and while yet it was playing the first tune, a tall figure, robed in creamy white, with gleaming sparks in her hair, and on her head a sort of crown, issued from the cabinet. She was recognized by a gentleman present, a spiritualist, whose spirit guide she was, and who addressed her as "my queen." She stood a few seconds behind the table, and then stepped out in the open space between the sitters and the table. The gentleman now arose from his seat, and, standing beside her, holding her hand, conversed in a whisper with her for some seconds. This was most assuredly a lady, if appearances go for anything. Her hands were quite small, and were warm and lifelike, as several, including myself, can testify, having been permitted to shake hands with her. At last she started to the cabinet, and as she went, appeared to grow shorter, until, as she disappeared between the curtains, she was not much taller than the table. The manager now explained that the spirit had remained out rather too long, and came near dematerializing before she reached the cabinet. Now came the spirit of a young man dressed in a light suit of clothes, who gave his name and said his mother was present. She was, and had a few words of conversation with him when he disappeared into the cabinet. The lady said that it was unmistakably her son, but there was something that was not as he had been, but what it was she was unable to describe. The next spirit to present itself was my son Eddie. He came out from the cabinet calling, "Papa, papa." The manager asked, "Who is your papa?" and he replied, "Mr. Smith." All this time he stood between the table and the cabinet, and only his head and shoulders could be seen. The manager told him to step out where he could be seen, when he came around to the front of the table. It was rather dark, but I could swear it was my son. He was just the right size, with long flaxen hair, and a very pale face. He wore a light-colored waist and darker knee breeches and stockings, with a large black bow at his throat, just as I remembered seeing him last in health. While Eddie was still standing in front of the table, a large man came out and shook him by the hand. Eddie spoke, saying, "Must I go back, Grandpa?" The form turned toward me, saying, "My son, this is a great pleasure to us, but we must not long remain, as it is our first attempt at materializing." He turned to go, when the manager said to him, "If the gentleman is your son, you ought to give him your name." "The name of the child is Eddie, and my own is J. A. Smith," replied the form, as they vanished into the cabinet. The manager suggested that it would be well to examine and see whether the medium had been out or not. The cabinet was examined, and everything found satisfactory. Spirit after spirit came from the cabinet, one or two at a time, for an hour. Some of them came to friends, and others were controls of the medium. Many of them were recognized by different ones of the sitters in the room. I, for one, could swear to the identity of my own son, Eddie, while my father was plainly recognizable. The room was again made dark. Suddenly there appeared on the floor, in front of the table, a light about as large as a baseball. It moved about in a circle of perhaps a foot in diameter, and grew larger. It soon lost the shape of a ball, and appeared to be a luminous cloud. Seemingly we could see into and through it. In the course of 30 seconds it had become as large as a 6-year-old child. Still there was no definite shape, only a fleecy cloud-like mass, turning, twisting, and rolling. At the end of perhaps a minute it was the size and shape of an adult person. The face could not be seen, but light, luminous spots were visible, as though the hairs and ears were decorated with gems. The shape spoke and requested light. As the light was turned on, the luminousness disappeared, and we beheld a beautiful young lady, clothed in a dazzling white costume. Her arms and shoulders were bare, and about her neck There was a necklace of what appeared to be very brilliant diamonds. Her feet were encased in white slippers, with straps across the instep. In her ears and hair glistened and shimmered beautiful diamonds. Her face and arms were as alabaster, and altogether she was one of the most beautiful women I had ever beheld. She was recognized by a lady and gentleman present as their daughter. They had met her here before. They were from the East and were wealthy. The spirit requested that they come to her, which they did, and were each kissed and embraced by it. They held a moment's conversation with her and resumed their seats when the lamp was slowly turned down. As the light became dim the spirit became luminous. The face and arms disappeared, and the body became as a cloud again, turning and twisting and growing smaller until it was nothing but a small light spot on the carpet, which of a sudden disappeared entirely. Immediately after this manifestation, an examination of the medium and cabinet was made, and it was certain the medium had not been away from his chair. The light was again turned out and the music box started, when two bright spots appeared on the carpet, one at either end of the table. These went through the same process of development until, when the light was turned on, there was another beautiful female spirit at one end of the table, and a child of perhaps 8 years of age at the other. The child was recognized by a lady present as her daughter, while the adult spirit was recognized and rapturously greeted by a gentleman who sat near me on my left as his darling angel guardian. They had quite a long conversation, in which they made use of very endearing language each to the other. I supposed it was the gentleman's wife. The spirits did not disappear as the first one had, but, when the light had been turned off, the luminous shape revolved a few times, and on 2 occasions assumed the garb and shape of men, and when the light was turned on again, there stood the men with beards and men's forms. After some 8 or 10 of these materializations and dematerializations before our eyes, the last couple completely disappeared. The light was again turned down, and a luminous shape came from the cabinet, followed by others, until 7 of them stood on the floor. The light was turned up until we could see the 7 spirits. 5 were females and 2 males. They were of different sizes. The curtain at the door of the cabinet had been pulled aside, and we could see the medium sitting in the chair in which he was bound. The forms now filed into the cabinet again, while the music box played. After they had disappeared, the light was turned up, an investigation made of the cabinet, and the séance was over. There, reader, is a truthful description of what can be witnessed at the séances of mediums who are artists. None of your bungling amateur work here. The work of such a medium is always satisfactory, for the reason that if a man feels sure that the medium is a fraud, he has been so well entertained that he does not regret the money paid for the opportunity to witness it. This is the class of medium also who frequently succeed in getting large sums of money from wealthy persons they have converted to spiritualism. Did the writer not give you the true explanation of the manner in which these things were produced, you would probably say it was conceived by a very fertile imagination. If you believed that he saw these things, you would perhaps offer the preacher's explanation by saying it is the work of the devil, or that of the scientist by asserting that it is the mesmerist's power over your mind, or the operator has discovered an odd force in nature, or go off on a long dissertation on hypnotism and fourth dimension of space problems. However, it is not the work of the devil, neither are there any but natural laws necessary to its production. The séance described actually occurred, and was described in writing by Mr. Smith in the language used, although it was not printed, and the writer was one of those who assisted in its production. We will now proceed to explain this particular séance. It will be remembered that the room and cabinet were carpeted with a dark carpet, and that the ceilings were of wood. The ceilings were decorated by being put on in panels. The ceilings of the cabinet would not have been like those of the room, had the closet been a part of the architect's plans of the house. It was not, but was made by the medium. He simply built a lath and plaster partition from the corner of a wide chimney to the wall, thus enclosing a space of 6 by 4 feet. The panel in the ceiling of the closet was 20 inches square. This panel was doctored and could be displaced, leaving an aperture large enough for the spooks to get through with perfect ease. A light ladder, which reached within 3 feet of the floor of the cabinet, was hooked fast above, and furnished the means of getting down and up again. There were 8 persons connected with the seance described by Mr. Smith, 7 upstairs, and the medium in the cabinet. Of course, it was not necessary that the medium get out of his fastenings, and the facts are that he did not. The table was placed across the cabinet door, not to lay the instruments on, but to be very much in the way should anyone make a rush and grab for the materialized forms. In case this occurred, the spooks above would close the light, making the room perfectly dark, and the manager would do his utmost to turn the table on end or side, with the legs out in the room. Before the grabber could get the lay of things and get past it, the spooks would have gone through the trap, closed it, pulled up the ladder, and the grabber would have found the medium writhing and groaning and bleeding from the mouth. The bleeding was for effect, and was caused by sucking very hard on his teeth and gums. The table also served a convenient purpose in the materialization and dematerialization through the floor. You now know where the spooks came from in this particular house, and how they got in and out. Now let us see how they managed the materializations, and the properties used to produce them. The trap and ladder were practically noiseless in their operations, but the music box made assurance doubly sure that the least sound from the cabinet should not be heard in the seance room. When the box began its first air, the trap door was opened, and down the ladder came a young man clad in a suit of black tights. He was entirely covered with black, with the exception of his right arm, which was bare to a point a little more than halfway from the elbow to his shoulder. The bare arm glowed with a luminous bluish light. This condition of things was brought about by powdering his arm with pulverized luminous paint. If you are not told the method of transforming the sticky paint to powder, you will not be able to do it, and will conclude the writer was romancing in this case. The most essential thing to you will be to know where you can procure this paint. The writer has been unable to procure it anywhere except of DeVoe & Company of New York City. It is put up in a package resembling 6-ounce jelly glasses, and you will get 6 of them for $5. In order to reduce it to powder, thin the contents of one of the glasses with 1 pint of turpentine. When it is thoroughly cut and incorporated into the turpentine, soak strips of muslin in it, and hang them out to dry. When thoroughly dry, you can shake the powder from the cloth. In order to powder one of your arms, gather one of the cloths in your hands, and use it as a powder puff on your arm. You will not be able to get all the paint out, but the pieces will make luminous crowns, slippers, stars, and luminous decorations for your robes. You will be under the necessity of perfuming your robes each time they are used, for the odor of the turpentine will always remain to a greater or lesser degree. To eliminate a robe or costume (the mediums always say robe), you proceed the same as in the powdering process, except add to the pint of paint you will add a wineglass full of Damar varnish, which will prevent its falling or being shaken off as powder. You are not to make the robe of muslin, but of white netting. Every lady will know what netting is. It is the lightest, thinnest material the writer ever sold in a dry goods store. 10 yards of it can be put into your vest pocket. Do not scrimp the material, but get as much of it into your robe as possible. When he of the luminous arm steps from the cabinet into the dark room, no part of him is visible save the arm. He picks the strings of the instrument with the illuminated hand and fingers, the keyboard with the other. He makes a sound of writing on the tablet, and tears off a leaf, which he conceals, and drawing a long black stocking over the luminous arm, places in the pocket of the sitter a communication that has been written upstairs in good light. This accounts for the even, beautiful writing, supposed to have been done in the dark. He covers the luminous arm so that anyone so inclined could not locate it in order to grab when he is near enough. By mounting the table, that luminous hand and arm can be made to show as though it was floating about near the ceiling. When 4 hands were visible, there were 2 spooks at work with 2 arms illuminated. You can readily understand the forces that floated the music box and table above the heads of the sitters, and an explanation is useless. When the first female spirit appeared, it was, in reality, a young woman dressed in a gorgeous white costume, without paint, hence the light was turned up instead of down, in order that she be visible. Rhinestones and Sumatra gems being cheap, she was plentifully supplied with diamonds, although many of those who are the queens or spirit guides of controls of wealthy spiritualist fanatics wear real diamonds, the gift of their wealthy charge, or king, as they usually call him. When she started for the cabinet, she used her hands to keep her robe from under her feet, and as she went, stooped lower and lower, until, as she disappeared in the cabinet, she went on her hands and knees. This is what caused the appearance of dematerialization. When Mr. Smith's son Eddie came from the cabinet, he was represented by a boy of about 8 years of age, the son of one of the female spooks upstairs. He receives $2 a night for his services, the same as the larger spooks. He was powdered until he was very white, a blonde wig put over his brown hair, and dressed as most boys are at the age Mr. Smith's son died. Mr. Smith recognized him by his size, his light complexion and flaxen hair, and the fact that he called him Papa and gave his correct name. His father was "made up" from the description given by the medium and acknowledged by Mr. Smith as correct. Of course he knew his own name, for it was given him by the slate writer. We now come to a part of the phenomena that all spiritualists who have witnessed it will swear by. What is referred to is the materializing and dematerializing of the spirit from the floor and before your eyes. In this you see first a small light, which grows larger and larger, until there stands before you a fully formed female or male spirit, as was described in Mr. Smith's experience. In order to accomplish what he witnessed, the same spook who had before been recognized by a gentleman as "his queen," prepared herself in the following way. Divesting herself of all clothing, she donned a simple long chemise that reached her shoe tops. She drew on a pair of white stockings, and over them a pair of white slippers. Into her hair and ears she put rhinestone diamonds, and around her neck a necklace of the same beautiful but valueless stones. On each earlobe and around her neck were put small spots of the luminous powder to represent the diamonds while it was dark. Her face was powdered, and her eyebrows and eyelashes darkened, while a dark line was drawn under each eye. She now took a black mask that covered her head and her robe in her hands, and went down to the cabinet. Arriving there, she put the black mask over her head to prevent the luminous diamonds being seen until the proper time. She carried her robe in a black bag. Crawling from between the curtains and under the table, she exposed on the floor a small part of her robe. This she shook and moved about, allowing it to escape from the bag until it was all out. She was now from under the table and on her knees, and it was time the head show on the form, so, getting close to the robe, she threw off and under the table the black mask. The shape was now the size of an adult. She adjusted the robe to her person and rapped for light. As a matter of course, when any light was made, the luminousness of the robe was drowned, and she appeared in simply a white costume. The necklace and eardrops could now be seen, but when the light was such as to reveal them, the luminous spots had disappeared, leaving the spectator to think the ones he now saw were the ones he had seen in the dark. The process of dematerialization will now be apparent, and the description will only tire the reader. One small spook was all that was required, as he could be made to represent boy or girl as was desired, by clothing him in the garments of either sex. At the close of the seance the full force of spooks came into the room. After disappearing, they shinnied up the ladder, drew it after them, closed the panel and the trap in the floor above it, replaced the carpet, and pushed over the place a heavy bedstead, from which they took the casters. They now carried the ladder downstairs and concealed it in the coal house as they went through it on their way home. They will get their pay next day. Should ever so close an examination of the cabinet be made, you could not find anything wrong. This particular medium has taken investigators into the cellar beneath the cabinet and the room above it scores of times, yet nothing was discovered. You are not always to search for the trap in the ceiling, nor yet in the floor. A trap is not possible in the ceiling except a closet is used as cabinet, and the ceiling is of wood. Where this condition of things does not exist, you must search elsewhere. The floor is a very likely place when it cannot be made in the ceiling. If you do not find it there, examine the base or mopboard. If it is in the mopboard, you will find upon examination that there is a joint in it near the corner of the cabinet, but you will find it solidly nailed with about 4 nails each side of the joint. This appearance of extraordinary solidity will be absolute proof that it is not solid. The nails are not what they appear, but are only pieces about 1/2 inch in length, and do not even go through the board. The piece is fastened on the other side with a couple of bolts that hold it very firmly in place. There is a corresponding opening in the mopboard in the next room, although no attempt is made to so carefully conceal it, as no one is ever admitted to it. Through this trap the spooks enter the cabinet by crawling and wiggling. It is not a very desirable trap, for the mopboard is scarcely ever wide enough to permit of a trap that the spook could get through in a hurry. Besides, they must assume their costumes after they get into the cabinet, or tear them to pieces. You can see how this would make it very inconvenient. If the room is wainscoted, the spook will have all the sea room necessary in his trap, for it will extend from just below the molding on the top of the wainscoting to the floor behind the strip of quarter round. It is next to an impossibility to detect these traps by examining in the cabinet. They were constructed to avoid discovery, and no pains spared to make them so absolutely perfect that not one chance in a million is taken. The proper place to seek for traps is in the adjoining room, upstairs, or in the cellar. One is foolish to undertake to find a trap by thumping the walls or floor, for if you happen to thump one, the medium who is smart enough to make use of a trap is also sharp enough to make provision for its being thumped, and your sounding method goes for naught. Bear in mind that when you are examining the cabinet, you are seeking at the very place that is prepared most effectively to withstand your investigations. Do not forget the manager in your search. He or she is never searched, or never has been up to date, which has been the cause of many a failure to find the properties of the medium when the seance was given in a room and cabinet furnished by a stranger and skeptic. Do not be deceived into a belief that all of the sitters are strangers to the medium. There may be 1 to 5 persons present who pay their money the same as yourself, and who may appear to be the most skeptical of anyone in the room. They will generally be the recipients of some very elegant tests, and weep copiously great grief-laden tears when they recognize the beloved features of some relative. They are the most careful of investigators, and, when the medium's trap is located in the door jamb, will pound the walls and insist on the carpet being taken up, when they will get upon their hands and knees and make a most searching examination of the floor. They are the closest and most critical of the investigators, but they are very careful to examine everywhere except where the defect is located. Because 1 or 2 men seem to be making such a critical investigation, do not allow that fact to prevent you making one on your own responsibility. Wait until they have finished, and then examine not only where they did, but more particularly where they did not. Their examination is only for the purpose of misleading others. Their tests are received in a way to cause those about them to think they admit them very unwillingly, or because they were so undeniable that they could do nothing else. A great many will probably deny that confederates are ever employed. They are not, by mediums who are not smooth enough to produce that which appears so wonderful as to make a good business for them. The writer could advise those mediums who give such rank seances to employ a few floor workers. They are easily obtained, and see what a difference it would make in the amount of business they will do. Get good ones, those who know human nature and know when they have said all that is necessary. Most of them are inclined to say too much, thus causing the ordinary man to suspect that they are confederates. End of section 42. Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, by Julian Hawthorne, editor.